Hello class, this is Carlos Asuna. I'll be presenting my Developmental Learning Design Project in How to Tie a Tie. I wanted to take this opportunity to walk you through the agenda of this presentation. First, I'll be going over the learning tasks and the learning outcomes. Then I'll go into describing the required prior knowledge and how the prior knowledge will be assessed. Afterwards, we will go over the learning activities for each developmental groups and we'll look at the analysis of the learning activities. In the last couple of sections, I'll talk about the research support and the developmental appropriateness and conclude with the assessment plan. The learning task being addressed in this presentation is how to tie a tie. There will be two different target audience. The first intended learners are adolescents, early adolescents, ages 12 to 13. The second intended learners are adults, early adulthood, ages 20 to 21. The learning tasks will be taking place in the context of a formal learning environment, and the workshop will be conducted on campus, either high school or college. By the end of the learning experience, the learners for both adolescent and young adults will be able to first articulate different types of ties, second, explain the usefulness and the purpose of wearing a tie, third, assess the social appropriateness of wearing a tie. This will differ for each of the group. Fourth, demonstrate how to tie a tie for a formal event. Again, depending on the group, they will either tie one type of tie or tie two different types of tie. Learners from both developmental periods will be expected to follow oral and written instructions. Since the learning test requires them to listen, comprehend, and follow direction, it is important for both of these groups to have the capability to understand verbal and written instructions. Also, they'll be expected to understand the difference between formal versus formal clothing so that the learning test can be focused on more specific goals. In order to assess the prior knowledge for both adolescent and young adults, there was two different methods being selected for each of these groups. For adolescent, a group interview will be conducted in the beginning of the workshop. They will consist of asking several questions that you see on the screen in the form of volunteering or raising their hands. In the second group, unlike the adolescent group, a survey will be conducted for the young adults in order to assess their prior knowledge. Ideally, the survey will be conducted via online or in their cell phone mobile device so that they'll be able to see anonymous results projected on the screen. The reason for conducting an online survey is to ensure that the learners will be able to answer the question in a very honest format. Many young adults may not know how to tie a tie, and because this may be perceived as a skill that young adults, especially males, should already know, there may be learners who will choose to conform to the rest of the group. In addition, the survey avoids the embarrassment if they admit to their peers that they don't know how to tie a tie, which can then affect their attitude towards the learning experience and causing them to have a negative emotion about it. The survey also prevents them to not lie about their prior knowledge, in which by doing so could hinder their learning experience. Learning activities for early adolescents ages 12 to 13. As you can see, there's a chart being provided to summarize the learning activities. In this chart, you will see four different columns within four different rows. The first column addresses the learning outcomes that's being addressed in the specific learning activity. The second column is the lesson plan, which is what the instructor will be doing. The third column is the description of the activity and what the learners are planning to do. And the fourth column is the closure in regarding how the activity will be ending. If I may please draw your attention to the first row. As you may recall, the first learning outcome was to articulate different types of ties. In this learning activity, the instructor will begin by showing 5 to 10 photos of people wearing a tie, and they will explain each type of tie. Then the learners will have an opportunity to create and draw a tie pattern that incorporates what they will wear in a formal interview, along with other information. At the end, the learners will turn in this illustration. In the second learning outcome, the instructor will divide the classroom into small groups. In the small groups, they will have about 2 minutes to come up with as many reasons on the usefulness and the purpose of wearing a tie. The small group who comes up with the most reasons will win a prize. And at the end, the instructor will hand out a sheet that talks about all the usefulness and the purpose of wearing that tie. And the third learning outcome, the instructor will show different video clips and photos in which, in a group discussion, the class will either demonstrate in that setting, whether it may be formal or informal, shows social appropriateness. In the fourth learning outcome, the instructor will provide a link as well as an illustration handout. And in this particular group, there will only be tying one type of tie, and the instructor will go around the room and help the students. The learning activities for early adulthood ages 20 to 21 is very similar to the early adolescence. Please note that for the learning outcome 1 and 2 will be addressed in the same learning activity. The instructor will begin the workshop by showing the learners some photos of other people wearing a tie, but in a different context, just as job interviews, wedding, parties, and office environment. As the photos are being presented, again, the instructor will talk about each type of tie. For the learning activities, the learner will be given a worksheet. In this worksheet, they will have about 4 to 5 different type of ties in which they will be asked to write down information, such as the name of the tie selection, and the style of it. Also in the worksheet, the learners will further explain the purpose of wearing each tie that's described in the worksheet. In doing so, this will support the second learning outcome of making sure that the young adults are able to articulate and explain the usefulness and the purpose of wearing that tie. In the third learning outcome, learners will be looking at different social situations. And in the group setting discussion, whether it may be in a video clip or photo, they will either consider whether or not that will be socially appropriateness. For example, wearing a bow tie, which is colorful, bright, would be whether or not would be a social appropriateness in an interview contact. In the fourth learning outcome, young adults will be attempted to tie 2 different types of tie. One would be the Windsor knot type, and the second would be a bow tie. The learning activities for both developmental periods are structured very similar. However, the content and the amount of information that was given to the learners differ from each development group. For example, looking at adolescents specifically, the instructors selected photos that are related to them. So making sure that the people that they did show were either young adolescents as well, and the setting were really tailored towards something that they're familiar with. So just as school dances or formal dinners. For young adults, they are able to think abstract. Therefore, in the selecting of the videos and the photos, it was all in a different social contact and in a different social settings. For adolescent, it was very purposely selected to encourage social learning environment to help each other out, whereas young adults, they were more focused on individual learning environment. For adolescents, due to best minimizing the cognitive overload in their working memory, it was better to have them master one type of tie, whereas young adulthood, they were able to, or they were encouraged to do 2 type of ties. For the first learners, early adolescent, I decided to focus on learning and motivation principles related to attention, self-efficacy, and cognitive load, as well as social cultural theory. For the second learners, early adulthood, I decided to focus on learning and motivation principles related to intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, instructional goals, and transfer. Some of the highlights in the developmental appropriateness is that adolescents are beginning to develop their own identity. So proposing an activity that involves them to showcase their personality by creating their own tie will engage them in their learning. For young adults, they are capable of advanced thinking, so therefore it was developmentally appropriate for them to engage in a more difficult task by answering different questions on the worksheet. Adolescents are in a small group so that they are able to help each other out, pull knowledge, compare notes, which at the end enhances their learning experience and promote advanced thinking. For adults, it was more appropriate to them to continue filling out the worksheet. Adolescents have not fully developed their social identity and are most likely to conform to what their peers have to say or do. So it was even more important for them to understand the difference between informal and formal. For young adults, an activity that involved them to think and reflect on their image and social regarding the tie and their careers was more developmentally appropriate. The instructor can assess the learners throughout the learning experience by observing and noting learners' participation in discussion activities. In order to determine whether the learners met the learning outcomes at the conclusion of their learning experience, the instructor will grade the assignment that were turned in. At the end of the workshop, the instructor will gather the group together and facilitate a short closing discussion. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it and look forward to learning about your project.